I thought about greatly how do you even begin this conversation, especially because it seems like one it's already ongoing before the seven of us gathered here today. And you brought up something that resonated with me just then, and that is building that relationship. But you all have talked about the years that you've spent, 20 plus years, different departments as law enforcement officers. And how does it feel now to lead these communities in which some have seen violence? How does it feel now to be in that position and realize that, or do you feel like the past 20 years, the work has not helped anything, or how do you feel about where we are now, given your experience and the fact that this seems to be something that you've been working on forever, building this relationship with the community, and the questions like, are we ever going to get there?
Start?
Go ahead.
So with that, I think that's a great.
What is that really, though?
Huh?
What is that?
So we can unpack that.
Okay.
But
You know I do.
So-
Yes,
so-
sir.
And this is pertaining to the civil rights movement?
it is pertaining
So
to
it
the
was
civil rights movement.
racism.
1960
No, I think it was okay. Anyone? Any questions, responses? As we keep going, just, just a ongoing conversation.
When you mention tension today, it is existing racial tension in your community, right? Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. Because I think there's also class tension. There's tension for various things all over this country. But I think in Virginia, racial tension is still so prolific. And it's something like Bloody Monday, I don't know how you get over that.
Well, most interesting about that and the civil rights era in general, my mother was born in 1963. My grandparents are still alive. So it's one of those things where people alive during that time are still here today.
Right.
So when we talk about trying to heal from those things, it's like, how do I even move on from something that pained me? As you talked about, this particular pastor, it was like personal for him, it was his wife. So how do I get over something that has pained me personally, pained my community? How do I even move past that when the structures at B appear to be still the same? And I think that I've heard that in sound bites from people across the country, that the structure then appears to be, from the outside looking in, because we're not officers, it appears to be the same structure in place all of these years later. And only thing that we can see or hope is that some of the ideologies, personal ideologies that people had, beliefs, are gone, and that they are changed because the systems that we see are the same. I don't know if you all can speak to that in your experiences.
Well, I personally just want to piggyback off of something the chief said. I go to Bible Way, where Bishop Campbell is my pastor, who was speaking of, and his wife is my first lady. And before Chief Booth came in, he spoke about the community police, and Bishop Campbell has always been, he hasn't stopped. Even since then, I will ask him, how can you sit in a community where that hurt come from, you never got an apology, but it's faith in God and still want to see change. So we had began a program through him called Community Law Enforcement Partnership Day. And that's when the community policing came about. We had the other chief come in and we tried to talk with him, and he said that we could not do community policing, that they didn't believe in reviewing the police department, that the power that the police department had stood within that structure right there. We still had the Community Law Enforcement Day, which is when we invite the police over. We invited everyone from the community. We had 102 to the gospel station there. We did it for about 2 years, but within that time, we still saw like a split between the police officers and the community. It's just it was a mindset that I believe people have. So fast forward, Chief Booth came in, because we had a lot of active things going on with the police department, but no one never wanted to acknowledge what really happened. When he came in, he did that apology. He said it was negative comments. It was ugly. I mean, he was called all kind of things on social media for making that apology, but he did not back down, and I believe that did open the door to show that someone was willing to change, even if it meant disappointing the equilibrium that we had going on. So even though I believe we do fight a structure, we're looking at it that way, I believe it's more of just not giving up hope, because like he said, it's been for 57 years with almost no change in the police department. Still, if they wrote the reports, you can't find out what happened. He wouldn't tell us, they wouldn't give us anything for years. Whereas, if I can, it's a touchy subject, but I'm going to walk into it. We had a young man who was killed about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, by the police department, but it was during a high time of racial tension, because there's always racial tension in Danville, if you ask me. And I believe things could have went really, really, really wrong if Chief Booth hadn't been in place. And when it happened, I was very angry. I went down to the police department. Chief Booth met us outside. It was teenagers marching, and they called me, and I'm saying, what kind of policies do you have in place that this won't happen and this and this? He said, what do you mean? I said, what kind of trainings are you doing? Why didn't they tase him? Why didn't they do this? He answered every question we had as best as he could, but after that, he went and released the video, which I believe quelled a lot of tension that was rising, because it was ready to be horrendous real quick in Danville, Virginia. But because he went to the local pastors, he went into the communities, he released that video, he talked to that man's friends, you know, it showed a change within that structure. And I believe since then it's still been continuing, but it still is some things that we can, you know, work on. I hope I didn't.
Yeah, I appreciate Chief Booth's words, you know, when you talked about acknowledging the issue. One of the most exhausting things as we are advocating for our community is trying to prove that something that exists. A lot of people say there is no racism. You see what I'm saying? And I'm wondering what rock they live under, and it's exhausting to keep. You know, it's in the news, it's everywhere, it's in books, it's everywhere, and a lot of people dodge the subjects by ignoring the subjects. And I think that one of the things that could help merge that divide between the police and the community is acknowledging the issues that are there, and then working with the community to develop a plan to, you know, bring that gap closer together. Right.
Yeah, and I think, you know, what Brian said is really important. It's critical. You know, we, in several different events we've been at, we've acknowledged the fact that, you know, in the 60s and 70s, there were people that wore this same uniform that I wore in Lynchburg, right, that did not treat African Americans fairly, right? And that's an understatement, right? And what we've got to realize, to your point, is that those people are still alive, right? And even if they weren't alive then, they don't take those stories and experiences and just bottle them up and keep them inside, right? They tell their children, right? They have the talk, right? They have the talk with their children, right? That every African-American family I've ever talked to says they have with their young black sons, to make sure they understand what you should and shouldn't do when you interact with the police. And so we've got to acknowledge that, which we've done several times in Lynchburg, and then we've got to realize our officers, as we're training them, they've got to understand that too, right? Just acknowledging it in the public's one thing, that's a step, right? But we've got to make sure our officers understand. You know, we train all of our officers in fair and impartial policing. We talk about implicit biases. We help them understand as much as we can, right? And we've got to get those folks interacting with folks that don't look like them, right? Because if the reality is the only thing that happens is the 6 of us get together and talk about this, that's a great start. But if our folks who are out there answering those 911 calls every day are not the individuals who are getting exposure, right, to someone who doesn't look like them, who grew up differently from them, right? You know, one of the stories I always tell, and it's true as true can be, when I was a young officer, right, I didn't grow up in a very diverse community where I grew up, and I didn't understand the importance in the black family of a mother figure or a grandmother figure, right? And so had we arrested an adult who was a young black man or black woman, right, and mom or grandma showed up, what would we often tell them? That's an adult, we don't need to tell you what's going on with them, you need to stay over there, ma'am. Well, what does that do to a mother or to a grandmother, right? It doesn't matter if their kid's 50 years old, right? They want to know what's going on with their son or their grandson, and you better tell them or you're going to have bigger problems than the kid you just arrested, right? So helping our folks understand that and helping people understand how there's differences in cultures, right, is really critical. And the only way that happens is to build those one-on-one relationships. A training is certainly helpful, but we've got to get out in the community and have those folks interact, and especially with our youth. That's critical. You know, Brian said he obviously, as a part of his full-time job, does that in counseling and that. And we've got to get our young officers interacting with our youth in our community, because that's where we build those relationships in non-enforcement settings, right? Because if the only time they see a cop is when somebody calls 911, well, it's already a bad day, right? We got to do that when they're not in those situations.
Well, and what I keep thinking is, I don't know, as policing exists today, it comes from systemic racism and systemic classism. That's just what it is. That is directly what it comes from, slave catching, and it comes from union busting. I don't know how policing as it exists today endorses community problem solving. Because in the case of George Floyd, if that person, whoever called the police on him, would have just talked to George Floyd about the bad check or the counterfeit money, George Floyd could still be alive today. In the case of Keontae Spencer, I don't know why the police showed up to Keontae. He's someone who was killed in Roanoke County. If someone would have just talked to Keontae and potentially asked him what he was doing, he might still be alive today. So sometimes, to me, when the police are involved, it is very often far too late. And so to me, it's not necessarily about building community policing. It is about building a resilient community, period. And I'm not saying that you guys are not a part of that, but it is about getting community members together and saying, hey, if you have an issue with your neighbor playing music, don't call the police, talk to them. And, you know, and just endorsing that kind of respect, because there are too many people dying or being thrown in jail over petty stuff. And we've all, I think, have to sit there and say no more. And I know that we can't get rid of policing as it exists. We can't get rid of racism as it exists today or tomorrow, even though I think if we could all just say, okay, no more racism, if the 6 of us could do that, we would in a heartbeat. But we can't do that, so it takes us coming together and saying no more. And I think instead of working to evolve the police department in a way where it's community members trusting the police more, it's evolving the police department so they are less necessary for community disputes. And then it is only in, you know, very drastic cases like missing persons that the police are necessary, because there's so much out there that I feel like the community is perfectly capable of regulating itself, and it's a lack of community trust in each other.
Tatiana, can I say something to you? So what it sounds like to me is you're speaking on neighborhood watch, which I'm completely for, and for a community coming together. But like in my community, and I hate to sound like the devil advocate, and I've been on both sides of the law, you know, I hate to sound like that, but we have a lot of black on black crime. I mean, sometimes we let those things, it seems like we don't want to talk about it because we're talking about the injustice that come. But a lot of those things, you don't have older men in the neighborhood no more to teach the younger guys to respect the older ladies. So I understand what you're saying to not really involve police, but from what I'm telling you, I've stayed in those neighborhoods. You have to, or when you take matters into your own hand, if you begin to teach people that have a certain mindset to take the law into their hands, you handle that. You got to look at who you're talking to when you're telling people to do that. And then maybe if you tell me, I can do that. I can say, let me go talk to my neighbor. But if I'm trying to teach a 21-year-old single parent who mad, and a man that hasn't seen his father in forever and been banging, and that's what that neighborhood consists of, and the daddy or the daddy's brother taught him how to hustle, they're not going to go for that. So you have to involve the law, but I think our part of knowing is who the law really is and what does the law protect. You know, do the law come to protect people first, or do they come to protect the law first when they pull up? You know, I think it's maybe if we understand that, but they have to be involved. But I understand what you're saying.
To me, it's about investing in these communities enough so getting involved in that kind of illegal activity isn't easier than, you know, getting public assistance anymore. Because anyone who I've ever known to sell drugs or something, it's because the public assistance isn't available to them. And I know it's different in a lot of communities, but, you know, to be real, like, to me, that's what we should be investing in. We should be investing in these communities so that that kind of violence or those kinds of choices aren't the easiest choices to make. And the easier choices are to contribute to their community by working in local businesses, like local to their neighborhood, working in local schools, working locally to actively benefit their community, rather than all of the other choices that are very often offered to them.
I think it's also easy to forget, because I'm even guilty of this sometimes, that police officers are people too.
Right,
in the
they
sense
live in the
that
community.
they live in our community, they can be our neighbors, they can be our friends, but people don't feel like that when you all put on these uniforms. How do we even begin to humanize officers? Because if our goal, and it seems is that people were agreeing that we need to better the entire community, and then that relationship will kind of evolve into a better space. But how do we get there when people don't see you all as humans? I mean, and something that I really want to touch on too, to get you all's perspective, and maybe you all can provide opinions and your own experiences. But I'm sure each one of you talk about being in these 20 plus years on law enforcement, living in Lynchburg for 20 plus years. How does it feel though that people are actually terrified of you? especially being that I'm sure you got into this wanting to help people 20 plus years ago as a young rookie officer thinking, I want to help my community. I see these issues. I want to be that beacon of change. But people are legitimately terrified of you in these positions. They do not want to call you. I know individuals, she talks about those neighborhoods that live in those neighborhoods who will witness crime and ignore it because they will not call you because they're afraid that you will hurt them. So how do you even change that? Because we can never get to community policing if people are just legitimately terrified of you.
Can I ask oh, go ahead,
No,
go ahead.
ladies,
Go ahead, Chief.
Ladies first.
Okay. I wanted to ask him a question or anyone in here. So I heard something you were saying about officer safety. I recently had a friend who had a car wreck, and so when the police came, they treated her very well. She gave a wrong statement, and I asked her why afterward. She said because she was afraid. Never had any problem with the law, never been in trouble, but she was just afraid of the police guy. He was a white man, and it just intimidated her. And so I wonder, the same way on her end with her mindset, I asked her where did she get it from? She said from what she sees, what she hears, that's in her mind, and what she knows personally in her family. So do you all think that when you go out, when you talk about officer safety, do you all feel that tension when you go into a upper class neighborhood? She spoke about systematic class or whatnot. Or is it just when you're around, and if you go into the ghetto parts of those neighborhoods, do you all feel that tension and fear? Do you all think y'all treat our young black men that maybe wear hoodies and maybe a little bit different than what you would? Do your tension rise up when you go around a white teenager or a white male? I'm just asking.
Sure.
Okay. Right. That's right. Right. I want to ask you about that too. I want to say, how does it feel being black right now?
Well, and what I'm, sorry, you had something. Okay. What I'm hearing is that, I mean, when you say things like dismantling implicit biases, I feel like it's a system built on implicit bias, and not even just from police, like also when you get into the prison, when you get into judges. But I know that you guys are not a group of judges, so we won't get into that. And I think, you know, what we shouldn't be encouraging people to do, like I said, this all can't happen tomorrow, but is coming up with public safety that is catered to each individual community. Because I overheard you two speaking about how your communities, like with your training, have completely individual needs. And every community has completely individual needs. And so what I'm hearing is that we need to imagine a system, and you know, I would like policing to be scaled back personally, but a system that just caters to specific needs. Because when I hear that people are afraid to call the police, and sometimes the police are afraid to show up for people, I'm like, okay, so this isn't working for anybody. And I think, you know, it's a very well-known statistic that suicide is the #1 killer of police in the United States. To me, that says, and like we're talking about humanizing police, to me that says this system is not serving them either. And as human beings, they should not be subjected to that kind of stress or mental health issues either. And so to me that says, like, I would much rather have the people trained to de-escalate a domestic violence situation, or specifically call people who have direct homelessness resources, or specifically call people when there is a mental health crisis who are trained to deal with mental health issues, than putting that extra stress on police. And that's just my personal preference. And I know the preference of a lot of people in the country right now. And it's not about dehumanizing police officers, but it's saying, hey, this system is hurting even the people who work for it, and it's not helping anybody. So as individual communities, let's get together and imagine a system that benefits everybody while recognizing that like we can't get rid of this stuff tomorrow, and that there is a lot of trauma, especially the Black community has, a lot of negativity in the Black community that needs to be addressed, and that we'll have to figure out. But first we need to put resources and information where it's most helpful.
You know, I'd say it's spinning back a little bit off of what both Sam and Scott said, and Tatiana as well. But you know, one of the challenges, right, is we oftentimes in law enforcement assume people understand why we do certain things, right? And the reality is they don't, right? The majority of people haven't worn badges, haven't carried out law enforcement duties. So it's really important we take the time to educate our community on not just what we do, but why we do it. That's the really big piece. And then on the same thread, we need to make sure we understand from our community how our interactions with Brian or Tatiana or Shakiva, whoever, how they leave those people feeling when we're done, right? Because my perspective of an interaction, I'll use Scott's example of the traffic stop. His perspective of that interaction with that young man or woman, right, was probably very different than the perspective of the person who was driving the vehicle, right? And I don't know, we've always historically in law enforcement done a good job of understanding how our interactions leave people feeling, right? So you know, one of the things we've been doing in Lynchburg over the last several weeks, we've got 3 more weeks going, we're doing listening sessions around the community where we are literally showing up at different neighborhood centers. We're not, I do a quick introduction and say, hey, here's a couple of things we've done, and we just sit and listen. We don't respond to questions, we just sit and listen. We hear people's stories. And I got to tell you, the stories I've heard over the last 3 weeks, and I'm sure I will hear for the next 3 weeks, have a very common theme in them. And it's how people feel when they're done interacting with the police, right? It's what that interaction, what that stirred up inside them, right? Which is a lot. And I think takeaways already are, you know, it's not so much always what we do, it's how we do it, right? We got to treat people with respect, no matter how we find them, right? Whether it's someone who's in mental health crisis, whether it's a homeless person, whether it's someone who's in the worst of the worst, whether the richest of the rich, poorest of the poor, anything in between, we got to treat all those people by the golden rule, right? And sometimes we don't always get that perfect, right? So we need to do a better job of interacting with our folks. And, you know, we've got to your earlier question, how do we get people so they're not scared, right? So that's some of it. The other part is, you know, when I went to the academy, it may be similar for these two young men, but, you know, I was always taught you don't ever tell anybody your first name, no matter what. If somebody asks you your first name, you tell them it's officer, right? Because there's this fear, right, that if you share your first name, something's going to happen. Everybody I always meet and interact with, my name's Ryan. Okay, yeah, my title is chief, but that's irrelevant, right? I'm Ryan. And we need to have those one-on-one interactions and know people on a first name basis. And Brian and I were just talking earlier. You know, we've got to start with our commonalities, right? If we start with our differences and try and work to the middle, we're never going to get there. We've tried that for decades, right, in law enforcement. We've got to start with what we have in common. What do we have in common? We talked about earlier right before we started. What do we have in common?
Lynchburg.
Okay, what else?
We men.
We men, and we've both got children, right?
Yeah.
We were just sharing a little bit of story about how some of the gray hair in my head and his beard come from teenagers, right? So we have that in common. We've got to have those personal connections, right?
Right.
Because the reality is if we went around this room, there's probably something every one of us have in common, right? And there's a lot of things we can start agreeing on. We can all agree right now that racism shouldn't exist anywhere. To your point, we aren't going to solve it overnight, right, or fix it. But there's so many other things that we can agree on, regardless of whether we wear a badge or not, okay, on what is right and what is wrong. And that's where we need to start and then work backwards from there and unpeel it. Because if we start and just go to our corners automatically, which is a human nature to do, we're never going to solve this thing.
When we go back and this airs next Thursday, you're going to see how once we reach the point where we realize, yeah, here are the things that we as officers are dealing with that frustrate us, and they were the same things that frustrate those who are not officers. That's when the conversation really came alive. Because I think we realized that, okay, well, maybe they do see the issues that we have. So how do you broaden that conversation? How do you start that change like now? Because I think people, I know as a journalist, in telling so many stories with officers, like, and not even just officers, this is really just anybody, anywhere. Policy takes time to change. The structure itself takes time to change. But how do we now, leaving this conversation, moving forward after this special airs, people see it, and even as the movement starts to die down, because like most things they do, and it will resurge at some point, but how do we really get down into those communities? You're talking about y'all are already starting it with the listening sessions, but how do we sit down and say, okay, here are 15 mental health counselors in our community. Let's put all of them on our community, police board that a lot of departments have. And they say, this week, McKinley, as the counselor is going to be on call. You and your people at your practice, just be ready on standby. And that's just an example of something that you could do, and I don't even know that you can do it. I don't know who is in charge of really making that immediate change that people can see now that we talk about, and how is it done?
I think one of the major pieces to narrow that gap is transparency. We can talk about policy changes, we can talk about things we want to do, but when you say that, people are looking for action, and they're not looking for action in 2 years. Once the governor signs off on it, they're looking for action immediately. And we've just all agreed that it doesn't happen that way. But I feel like walking the community through the process, the media they may announce that policy is changing, but then you don't hear about it anymore. So it's like, see, they said they were going to do something, but they didn't do it, which causes that gap to broaden. So I think education, I think transparency. You hit the nail on the head when you said, complaints may be made, but you don't hear about what happens afterwards. People are just kind of waiting. And in the waiting, frustration hasn't left. You know what I'm saying? So the tension just gets tighter. It makes the community a little bit more at unrest. So I think educating the community, Chief Zudum is doing an excellent job with going to the different communities and allowing them to speak their piece. But it's, what are you going to do afterwards? You see what I'm saying? And I think that's going to be the big piece. Chief Zudum, I call him Chief Z.
Chief Z is fine.
Chief Z, he came through, he talked, he listened. That was in 2020. So around Christmas, people are going to want to know, well, what did he do with the information that we gave him? What is he doing with my story that I put out there when I made myself vulnerable by showing up? Number one, because, it's not, an acceptable thing in our community to even talk to police. I showed up, I gave my story, what are you going to do with it? And I think that's where, that's where the community is right now. He's listening, he got a few more weeks, but then after that, what's going to happen? I think also the police should reflect the community more in the police officers that are there. Most of the time when police show up, when I call, they're white. That causes a divide, you know what I'm saying, because of the racial tension. They don't look like us, so can they really relate to us? And when you're having exchanges with the police, you don't really get to talk to them and say, hey, I got 2 kids that are teenage. You see what I'm saying? So I think, we need more African American and people of color on, as police officers. As a matter of fact, we really need some directly from our community. You all said that you all traveled different places and became chiefs. You see what I'm saying? So you're not really from out. I didn't go to school with you. You see what I'm saying? So if we're gonna really relate to the community, I wish we had more police officers that were directly from our community. That hits another spot because most of us do not qualify to be police officers. You see what I'm saying? So I know I just kind of went around, but I think if we're gonna do that, we need to, see some of that come to pass.
And something you were saying, I have a question too, McKinley. But being consistent, like you said, once you start it, keep it going. But a question I do have is about policy, because like I said, I've been on both sides of the law, and so I'm believing my understanding of the police. When I saw to protect and serve, I was thinking it was to protect and serve the people first. Right. But I'm learning it's more to protect and serve the law first. And so it seems like y'all are kind of, not you all in general, but kind of callous when they come around. And I'm like you said, the guy had to be in the handcuffs. To me, it's like, when you see that with your own eyes, it's like y'all almost have no heart. But I understand that I'm learning that it's really not, even though we are a community, that your first obligation is to uphold that law than it is to have, even though you do have some compassionate officers, but then it is to have compassion. So I believe we can understand that as a people, that when they come, they may not show emotion, but this is why, because their first obligation is to the law, and then maybe to kind of see what's going on, because I didn't understand it, so it looks terrible. And then I have a question about, you all are nice who we're talking to, but y'all have other officers in the department, and I'm saying from what I've saw from both sides, I won't call them road cops. I don't know about Lynchburg and I don't know about Roanoke, but I've lived in Danville forever. So you have those officers really that are nasty, that cause people, how free can we be in here? niggas, and I've saw it, you know, and it's so different for me now being on this side of the table, being in the meeting rooms with those same officers who portray one thing at tables, but I've saw them in different environments before I got saved. And I understand I was in reckless environments, but they still didn't treat us like humans either. But how do you all deal with those cops that I know you probably hear their name come back to the department as that one harassed me, that's the one that hit me, that's the one that did this? What do you all do when we try to do community policing? Not with you, Chief Booth, because you have been very open, very transparent. You in every community, every neighborhood, y'all walking all the time.
Shakiva, that
but
kind of
how?
cop needs to.
Okay. But they're still there.
They need to go. But
Well, and
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'll go after you.
thank you. I think in Roanoke, like you were saying, it's yes, conversations, of course, but majority action. Like we just need to at least know that things are happening and making the process completely transparent. And what I see No Justice, No Peace as is not just a protesting group or a group that makes a lot of noise, but a group that educates the community and puts out information and makes it accessible. So for talking about Roanoke, like I genuinely think a person showing up with a gun should be the last resort. For a lot of instances. So I think it's empowering the community to have our own conversations and to be resilient, putting resources towards people who are more qualified to deal with these issues, and then just putting resources towards issues that can be more directly remedied with funding. Because I know like when it comes to solving homelessness, it's putting a lot of money toward, like there are things in Roanoke that have been proven to work, like I think it's the Blue Ridge Homelessness Network or something like that. Their algorithm works, it's just like they need the funding. And so instead of relying on police officers to deal with this problem for a night, having long-lasting solutions to these problems. So what I want to see is action and most definitely transparency. Because I know like Rashid Mormon, for example, I know that that's the state police investigating that, but I would love to be able to communicate with the community about what the state police are finding, because knowing that another Black man died, and whether, you know, no matter the circumstances, it's hard to say that anyone deserves that. So I think just having that transparency as tensions are incredibly high, and saying, hey, here's what we're working on, here's how we're going to do it, and creating actions based on conversations, not having conversations and then continuing the same actions. I think that's what will help Roanoke a lot.
I'd just say off of what Scott said, you know, unpacking a little bit of that, you talk about barriers that are sometimes in place, right? And, you know, in the importance he also said of speaking up, right? And you made mention to it too. You put yourself out there, right? You came out, and a lot of people in your community were probably like, what are you doing talking to the police, man? Right. Like, come on, what are you doing, right? But you know, one of the things we heard really early on is, and we've met with dozens and dozens of individuals and groups over the last, you know, couple of months. And one of the things we heard very early on from one of our groups is, hey, it's 2020, why don't you guys have an online complaint form? And we kind of looked at each other and we went, that's a really good question. Yeah. There's no reason we don't, we'll have it up. So we got our IT folks, and within a week and a half or so, we had a form on there that we could properly, you know, track and make sure it acquired all the right information. But, you know, if people don't speak up and say something like that, you know, the old saying is, why do we do things the way we do it? Well, it's because that's the way we've always done it, right? Well, that's also a horribly bad answer in many cases, but sometimes we also, as human beings and as organizations, we have blind spots, right? And that was a blind spot for us. You know, like we had a process where you could certainly, you know, file a complaint in a lot of different ways, but not online. So that's available now. So sometimes we aren't even aware of some of the simple things. And like when we talk about see in action, right? That's an actionable item. That was done within a week and a half. It's out there. We put it out there. Here you go. Please use it, right? So, you know, a lot of times we need that feedback. We need that gift of knowledge that we may have, for whatever reason, ignored. We may have overlooked, whatever it may be. And the more we can have those conversations to say, hey, this is how the community feels about the way you guys do this, to Scott's point, we can look at it and go, well, maybe there's a better way to do it, right? And I think we can't, and Scott said it well, we can't get offended when the community challenges us. If we ever get to a point where the community is not challenging us, then we've completely failed and lost. Because that means people are, one, either say we're doing everything perfect, which I know will not be the case, right? Or they've given up, right? And they've said, you know what, we can't do anything, we're just throwing the towel in. Just they're going to do whatever they want to do anyway. So we want that feedback, and we need that feedback.
Right. And I think, I'm sorry, to piggyback off of that loss of hope, it goes back to what you were saying initially when we talk about black on black crime, but it also, we got to talk about her when you talked about empowering the community. I think, you know, when we talk about the black on black crime, a lot of that stems from the loss of hope. When you give in to gangbanging, when you give in to drug dealing, when you give in to, you know, living in poverty, it's a complete loss of hope. Why is there such a loss of hope? Because we don't feel like we can get the jobs that we need in order to thrive. If we get a job, you know, they're not going to pay me nowhere near as much as this activity will pay. We can't trust the police. We can't trust the system at all. You see what I'm saying? And I think a lot of the distress that comes from our community is feeling like we can't trust anyone. We don't even trust ourselves. You see what I'm saying? So what you're saying, it may seem outlandish and crazy to some people to say, we don't want the police, and you know, that should be the last resort. You know, the community should be empowered. To some people, that's like, what? But we need the police. But no, we need to empower the community. We need jobs in the community, which is definitely outside of policing. But it's one of the issues that causes our communities to be degraded so bad by us is because we feel like it doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? That the police show up, they're gonna beat somebody up, they're gonna arrest somebody, they're gonna do something, then they're gonna go about their business. So no, we're not gonna complain, even if you put the complaint forms online. I talked to Chief Z about this before. That's the same reason we don't vote. We're not gonna complain. Our voice doesn't matter. So letting us know that our voice matters, letting us know that you all are human, that you do care, that level of compassion, seeing the heart of the police department would go a long ways to let us know, like, hey, maybe they do care. Maybe they are there just to do their job. That would help, you know, close that divide, but also, you know, pouring back into the community some type of way. And it is a risky thing, because at sometimes, even I'll say, even for myself, sometimes I feel like, man, why advocate for the community when they're going to turn around and do this? When we read about what's going on in the community, it's frustrating. But at the same time, I grew up there. You know what I'm saying? So I understand the lack of hope. Chief Z was talking to me about who, you know, my spiritual father is Sterling Wilder. And I told him, man, I kind of lucked up with that, because if it wasn't for him, I really don't know where I would. I grew up in Greenfield. You see what I'm saying? Like, I don't know where I would be had I not lucked up and ran into the right man at the right time, who poured into me, who did not see me as a lost cause, because I was. He showed up on the corner when I was high, looking crazy, and would talk to me and talk to me about how great of a man I would be in the future beyond that moment. So until we get to the point where we're pouring back into the community, empowering the community, I think this is going to be something that remains for a while.
Well, can I come, if it's okay? So I understand what she's saying, I understand what you're saying, I'm with all of that.
Right.
But when we're talking about a community, I'm listening to you. I'm being on both sides,
Right.
just like you just said.
Right.
But we're still making a divide, even when we're saying, if you don't call the police, you don't have to call the police, but we're still, the way I'm hearing it, and I could be wrong, we're still leaving a split. It's already a distrust amongst us with the police.
Right.
So what you all are saying, which I'm all for, that's what I do in my city. I work for Housing Authority. Before that, I had got me a nonprofit. I had it for 10 years because I know what it's like to come from nothing.
Right.
I know what it's like to come from an unfavorable household situation. So from my heart, I do it. You understand? But at the same time, it takes all of us. So when you're saying to leave them out,
No.
I'm not saying that's what you
okay.
exactly mean.
All right.
I understand the empowerment. We have to help each other, but these are each other as well.
Right.
When they take their uniform off, they're still community. They don't have to be called out maybe to every call, but they still should be involved. If we leave them out, then we're still teaching that mindset, distrust the government.
Right. Right.
You see what I'm saying? I'm not saying that's not empowered. I have a young black son. I have 4 daughters. I'm a single parent, been that way forever. But I still do empower them with all I have, but it takes a village for me to do that. It takes a village for me to go back and tell my people who I know may be doing some unfavorable things right now, because they have lost hope, but they haven't tried either. I was a person that didn't try. I always went by like that person I said what they saw. So it ain't no jobs for me. I'm from the hood. Right. I got tattoos. Right. I'm this person's daughter. What hope do I have? Right. Until I stepped out. I did have a mentor, you know, and I thank God for the mentor, but he could only take me so far. I still had to step out myself and try the waters. So a lot of stuff we don't experience is because we don't try. We give up hope, whether I can empower you all day, but until you go out and try it. I tell my children the same thing. Well, Mom, I ain't gonna be able to do this because of this. How you know? What did you try? So I'm with the empowerment. I love it. But if we talk about empowering our community, and leave the officers out. They're a community even when they take their badge off. And I'm talking about, I'm not saying that I'm all for every officer, because I'm telling you, when I say I've been on the other side, I mean wrongly injustice by the police department in Danville, Virginia. Before Chief Booth got there, my life drastically messed up because of the police department. So I'm with all of that. You understand what I'm saying? But when we having this conversation, I'm hearing you all say scale the police back, when that's where the tension is already at, because we feel like they're not involved already. Maybe we should have those mental health people come out. I'm with you on that. Maybe it should be certain people that approach certain situations, but these people still need to be involved in those conversations of how it's going to be done. Because if we lead them out, then they come to the situation callous, no emotion. It's because we're making them that way now when we're talking about, and I'm with it. I understand perfectly what you're saying. I do believe if you can handle that situation, it should be handled. But I do believe that we should not leave them out of that conversation. Maybe they don't have to be on that call, you know, when we're having it in the community, but they need to be involved in that conversation, or the divide is going to continue to divide. And that's just the way I see it.
Well, I think we've learned today that we all kind of have homework to leave with. You know, there are things that we can do immediately with the people in our close community that we can reach, and then within our departments, hopefully, that you talk about some of the things you're doing now, that you're working on, but hopefully from here, as more of these things happen and whatnot, we'll see that change on both sides, with issues that you feel like you have within your departments and then issues we feel like we have within our own communities. And on the other side of that, hopefully we can look back at this conversation and say, wow, 6 months from now, I actually did change X, Y, and Z. You talked about that complaint with the online complaint forms. 2 weeks later, you're able to actually look back and see it's there. And so hopefully, you know, we'll all have that experience when leaving from this conversation. Any very brief last minute notes anyone has?
Yes. We are planning Unity Matters. That's why I have my little face mask on. Because we do, you know, Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, but I think we're losing community. And so Unity Matters, we brought it to the chief and he agreed to have some police dialogue, but it's going to be a day of education in Danville, Virginia on August the 28th, which will be 57 years since Martin Luther King made a speech up in Washington. It's going to be a Bible way, you know, on site on the campus. It's a day of education, Tatiana, so you're welcome to come. There's going to be different booths of empowerment, trying to get us back to this virtual learning and whatnot, but it's also going to be police dialogue. They're going to have their booths set up and whatnot. August the 28th, 2020, Unity Matters.
I just want to say that I think it's worthy of deeply observing issues within the Black community, especially when we talk about Black on Black crime. I think that can be a whole other panel, and I think as a community we should be facilitating those conversations as well, and like looking at the history of why the Black community is so disempowered, and so much of it is because yes, the country put us there, and also just like when I say outside of policing, I just mean as it exists today, and that it's more about facilitating conversation rather than come arrest this person because they told me to put a leash on my dog, you know. And that's, and because I do think that like you are a part of the community. It's just about doing what is best for the community as well.
And yeah, to piggyback off what she said, yeah, I wasn't saying we want our communities to operate independent of the police. We would still operate interdependent of the police, but we need to see our communities, you know, less disenfranchised and poor and impoverished and hopeless, so that when the police show up, there's a level of respect, there's a level of relationship, where we are understanding of one another. Even if somebody got to leave in handcuffs, we understand why and we understand the process.